a part of it. Let's talk today about Lottie Moon. Anybody in here say, this is our last person? Anybody here say, I knew all 6 people that we talked about? Right? Hopefully everybody in here say, I know who Lottie Moon is. Right? If you've been around Baptists at all, we put Lottie Moon's name on everything. So you probably have seen Lottie Moon. Today's a great day to talk about Lottie Moon because today is, for us, Walk to the Manger. So today's the day we take up our Lottie Moon Christmas offering, which goes 100% to the IMB. We'll talk about that a little bit later. That comes directly from Lottie Moon. It's not always been called that. It gets called that later, actually after her death, but it comes from that. So let's talk through Lottie. We're going to talk through her life and her ministry, and then we'll talk about some impact that she had on the SBC and missionaries in general. And as with all these folks, I've tried to, when I can, talk about both the good and the bad, and to be really clear that we love these folks and we're honored to share their heritage and we're thankful for the way the Lord used them, but they weren't perfect. And so it's, I think, a helpful exercise in this setting to talk about both good things and bad things, the things that we can learn from on both sides of that, and to acknowledge that even people that we have a great deal of respect for missed it sometimes. And so Lottie Moon gives us an opportunity to talk about that, both with her and the SBC in general a little bit. So let's talk about her. She was born May 21st. Is that right? I'm sorry. No, that's not right. That's still the other guy. She was born December 12th. Your book is right, correct? Yeah. Your book is right. That's not right. She was born December 12th. I was like, she's not. No. December 12th, 1840 in Charlottesville, Virginia, and died December 24th, 1912 in Kobe, Japan. She was actually in the harbor. She was right outside Kobe. She was on a ship harbored at Kobe, Japan, when she dies. This picture obviously is taken later, taken in 1937, but this is the home that Lottie Moon grew up in. She still has family and relatives. I actually just saw somebody yesterday post a picture of, I believe it was like Lottie Moon's great niece who had come to their church to talk about the Lottie Moon Christmas offering or something. So obviously she's young enough that we still know a lot about her life and a lot about her family. This is the house that she grew up in. She was born to affluent tobacco farmers. They were staunch Baptist. Her father died when she was 13. She was the 4th of 7 siblings, 5 girls, 2 boys. She was, like almost all the folks that we've talked about, she was an extremely bright young lady. All ththese guys have been gifted just in their intellect, and Lottie Moon was no different. She was extremely bright. She attended the Albemarle Female Institute, which was the women's counterpart to the University of Virginia. In 1861, she became one of the first women in the South to graduate with a master's degree. So Crawford Toy, who we'll talk about a little later, called her the most educated woman in the South. So it's a huge deal. She's a really incredibly bright woman. While there, she studies, there at the Female Institute, she studies Greek, Hebrew, Latin, Italian, French, Spanish, and then, of course, later in life, she learns Chinese as well. So this is a woman of incredible intelligence, that even before she learns Chinese, she learns Greek, Hebrew, Latin, Italian, and French, and Spanish. So anybody in here speak 2 languages? Yeah. The difficulty of speaking and knowing 2 languages alone is really, really hard. And then imagine being conversant in that many languages. It's an incredible thing. God gifted her in an incredible way. She was impacted even as a young girl by the life and the writings of Ann Judson. So it's sort of been interesting as we've gone through the 6 weeks. Almost everybody, we can sort of draw a line of how they were influenced by the people who came before them. So Adoniram Judson's wife, Anne, obviously wrote memoirs, and which her memoirs are on the back table if you're interested and want to pick those up. She read those as a child, as a young girl, and was impacted by the life and writing of Ann Judson and what was happening in Adoniram's life. She rebelled against Christianity for a time in her life, like so many people do. In her teenage years. She experienced a spiritual awakening at a revival led by the pastor John Broadus. He was, at that time, the former pastor. He had come back for the revival at the First Baptist Church of Charlottesville in December 1858. So we'll talk about John Broadus a little bit later. Anybody know what seminary John Broadus helped to found? Southern Seminary, yeah. Southern. He was one of the founders of Southern Seminary. Was the pastor there at First Baptist Charlottesville. That it's at that revival there at that church that she has this awakening. The Lord opens up her eyes. So she trusts Christ. Then she's baptized. That's early December. She's baptized December 22nd in 1858. After her conversion, she stays in Virginia to assist her mother. They, as we said, they were very well-off tobacco farmers. She came from a very affluent family. She stays in Virginia to assist her mother in managing the family and the farm during the Civil War. So this is just part of who Lottie Moon is. She's a staunch Confederate. Her family owned slaves. Her family was one of the families that was devastated by the war. So if you look at her wealth from her family, after the Civil War, her family has about 1/40 of the wealth that they had before the war. So she, along with her sister, both served as nurses to Confederate soldiers and Confederate troops. John Broadus served as a chaplain for the Confederate Army during the Civil War. So she stays in Virginia. She's baptized in 1858. Civil War begins 1861, I believe. And so she's in Virginia, stays there to help her mother, because her father has now passed away, stays to help her mother run the farm. Eventually, after the war's over, she teaches school in several places. She actually comes to Kentucky. Anybody know where in Kentucky she taught? Danville. Yeah, she comes to Danville, Kentucky. Yeah, everybody knows Lottie Moon. Y'all could teach this class. I really wanted to... I'm assuming you all got the magnets from the GAs last week. They were out in the lobby. I should have let them come in here and teach this class. They know more about Lottie Moon than I do. So she teaches school in Danville, Kentucky, Georgia, and then later back in Virginia as well. In 1870, her mother dies. It's about that same time that she begins giving money directly to a missionary in China. In 1872, her sister, Edmonia Moon, was appointed to serve as a missionary in Qingzhou, China. And in February 1873, she hears a sermon at First Baptist Church of Cartersville, Georgia. And it's during that sermon, it's during that text that she feels called to join her sister in China. So in 1873, she decides she's going to go to China. That's the same year that she leaves to go to China. FBC, Cartersville, Georgia, actually is able to support her. So this is the first, I guess what we would consider a technical Southern Baptist that we've talked about, and the 6 people that we talked about. Anybody know what year does the Southern Baptist Convention start? 1845, and we'll talk a little bit more about how that comes about in a little bit later. The Southern Baptist Convention starts in 1845. They had both a home mission board and a foreign mission board. So what we now call the North American Mission Board and the IMB was the home mission board and the foreign mission board. And so they had a foreign mission board so that missionaries would apply to be sent as a Southern Baptist to places. So her sister, Edmonia, is sent through the foreign mission board. And so when she decides that she wants to go to China as well, she goes through the foreign mission board. At that time, this is one of the reasons that leads Lottie to press for a change. What we have now is called the cooperative program. Cooperative program doesn't come around until 1925. And so up until that point, foreign mission board and home mission board were supported just by offerings. And so it led to them continually asking churches for contributions. They would have sort of a similar deal. They would have a yearly offering that they would ask people for. Often that meant that the home mission board and the foreign mission board were having to take out loans to pay for stuff up front, hoping that then the offerings would be able to give them enough money to pay those things back. And it was a really messy deal. So 1925 is when Southern Baptists decided there's a better way to do this. So they created what's called the cooperative program, where they encourage churches to give a percentage of all their offerings to the cooperative program, to the SBC, which then is split up amongst IMB, North American Mission Board, the 6 Southern Baptist seminaries, the Ethics and Religious Liberties Commission, and all those things are split up from the money that we give to the cooperative program. There's nobody else that does what we do, quite like how we do it in the cooperative program. I think it's one of the best ways to fund not just missionaries, but to fund seminaries, to fund what we do as a Southern Baptist Convention. And it's a tremendous thing and has made both the IMB and them much, much healthier. It's the reason we're able to have seminaries that are well funded because we have the cooperative program. So that's coming, but that's not coming until 1925. Lottie Moon's long gone by then. She goes as a missionary from the Foreign Mission Board. And so it's really, really, really helpful for her as she's sent out to have a church like FBC Cartersville, Georgia, to say, we're going to help support you. So they're sending money directly to her. They're helping to keep her on the field. She's getting some sort of money from the Foreign Mission Board, but it's sporadic. They're paying her when they can. They're taking out loans to try to pay missionaries, try to do what they need to. And so that's not always very stable. So it's a great thing to have a church that's willing to say right before she leaves, we'll help support you. And they do. They help to send money. So this is a picture of young Lottie Moon. That's the picture of the ship that she sails on. So she goes in 1783. She follows her sister there to China as a missionary from the Foreign Mission Board. She was 32 years old at the time. Not long after, she declines a marriage proposal then. We'll talk about she declines another marriage proposal later in life. She leaves her job, her home, her family to go to China. In 1876, she brings Edmonia back. Edmonia gets sick. I'm trying to say this gently. And Lottie Moon was much better suited for China than Edmonia was. She was never happy there. She was sick often. She struggled with depression. Lottie will write in journals, which, by the way, there's diaries of Lottie's and letters back on the back table if you want to see those. Often that she struggles to get Edmonia just to come out of the house, just to go do things, just to go out and to be among people. And so in 1876, finally Edmonia comes home. And so it was sort of a disgraceful thing to sort of quit the mission field. She was not in great health, but her health compared to the health of folks who had stayed on the field was pretty good. And so it was sort of a disgraceful thing. She has trouble finding work when she gets back to the States. There's an ad. I don't think I put it in yours, but there's an ad in one of the early mission magazines that the Baptists put out that's essentially Edmonia saying, I'm a teacher and I just need work. And she's trying to find work. She lives and eventually does find work, serves as a teacher. Her and Lottie correspond back and forth quite a bit until the end of Edmonia's life. We don't know much about the end of her life. We don't know much about what's going on in her life. She didn't write like Lottie did. She does in 1908, she does commit suicide. We don't know a whole lot surrounding that. We don't know what was going on in her life that may have led her to that point. What things may have contributed to that, but she does have a tragic end to her life. But Lottie comes back with her in 1876. Lottie brings her home. In total, she serves in China for 39 years, mostly in the Shantung province. She labored chiefly in a place called Tingxiao in Shantung province. She teaches girls. She goes into villages and would often start schools, and that was her way to be able to get into homes. And so she would teach girls, and then it was through the relationship with these students that she would then be able to have access to families into homes that she probably wouldn't have access to before. So if you remember, as all this is sort of going on, we talked about this with Hudson Taylor at the same time last week, that there is a growing anti-foreign, anti-Western, anti-white sentiment in China. And so there's natural skepticism of Lottie. She's not always received very well. She's naturally often put off. But her coming as a teacher and serving students gives her a better way to interact with families and a better way to get into homes that she maybe wouldn't have had otherwise. So she teaches girls. She makes, like Hudson Taylor did, she makes frequent trips into the interior of China to teach and to share the gospel. One of the interesting things about her life is she was a Southern Baptist. She didn't think that women should be the primary preacher in a church. And yet we see her oftentimes when she makes these trips to the interior of China, she preaches. When they hold services, she preaches because she can't get any of the men that are with her to preach. And so she writes in her journals about how she doesn't really want to, but she preaches because she can't get these men to do it. And so that was a conviction of hers that she didn't think she should be doing that. But she would preach because sometimes it's not even Baptist. It's sometimes Presbyterian men who are with her. and often there are no men with her. So what was happening at this time is the same struggle we have now as Southern Baptists, that we have a lot of women on the field and very few men on the field. And so that was part of Lottie's deal, is that not only could she not get the men who were with her to preach often she didn't have any men with her. It was women who were by themselves in the deep interior of China trying to share the gospel. And the Foreign Mission Board was having trouble to get men to commit to go overseas. So she makes, like Hudson Taylor did, lots of trips into the interior of China, which is the more dangerous area. She shares the gospel, often with women and children. She does preach some when she feels like she has to. In 1885 alone, just that year alone, she makes 122 trips to 33 different places. So obviously those are short trips, 3 to 5 days, sometimes less, sometimes a little more. She was feared and rejected by Chinese natives. We'll just run through a couple pictures of things that Lottie saw. This is the China that Lottie served in. She was often asked to leave the areas that she was in because she was not just a Christian, but she was Western, she was white, she was foreign, and so they were naturally pretty skeptical of her. This is the home that she lived in China for a little while. Another picture of some folks serving with her. Eventually, like Hudson Taylor does, at the beginning she doesn't do this, but remember what was distinctive about Hudson Taylor's ministry in China? He dressed like the Chinese. He adopted as much as he could Chinese customs. She doesn't do that at the beginning, but before long she begins to do the same thing that Hudson Taylor does. That's why most of the time if you see her, I think we've got a picture coming up a little later, when she's older, she's got Chinese dress on. That she didn't do that at the beginning, but the longer she's in China, and we'll talk about why that is, the longer she's in China, the more she adopts Chinese customs and dresses like the Chinese in order to reach and to connect with them. Here's another picture. I think this is on one of her trips in the interior, or an area that she went to in the interior, rather. That's her seated in the chair. I think this was on a furlough. I think she was home. I'm not sure who is beside her. It's 2 missionaries that served with her, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure of those names. So she adopts Chinese dress, learns Chinese language and customs. Ultimately, was pretty well accepted by the Chinese, especially in the province that she served, and in Tingchao. She leads. We don't know for sure. She doesn't keep records like some of the other guys do. We know hundreds of people come to Christ directly through her, and then many, many more through her influence and through other missionaries that she supports and works with, churches that she helps to plant. But she personally leads hundreds of people to Christ. Throughout her time in China, she has really just a steel back, just a steel spine in the way that she is faithful to share the gospel, even when other people pulled out. So we've already said she's making deep trips into the interior of China, which is the most dangerous place when they can't get men to go there. And Lottie Moon's going up there, sometimes by herself, which alone takes courage and great trust in the Lord. But other things happen when she just shows great trust in the sovereignty of God. So I want to tell you the right province. There's a province not far from her, an area called Shaoling, that she had some connection to with the church that was there and some believers that were there. Close to, not quite, about 10 years before the Boxer Rebellion, the Christians there come under persecution. And Lottie finds out about it, and Lottie goes to Shaoling and basically gets in the face of the folks who were persecuting Christians and says, it was Chinese Christians, and says, if you're going to kill them, you're going to have to kill me first. And they sort of back down. 1890, I believe. And stands in the face. It's not even her people, right? This is another village. She goes and says, if you're going to kill us, you're going to have to kill us all. And stands him down. In 1911, I love this story. In 1911, there was a Chinese revolution going on, so there was infighting there in China. And the Foreign Mission Board pulled everybody out, asked everybody to leave, to come to the coast while the fighting was going on. And Lottie said, no, I'm not leaving, I'm staying here. So while this is going on, she finds a hospital that all the men had left. All the people who were leading and running the hospital had left. So Lottie takes over and runs the hospital for 11 days And so until it's safe, and then the people come back, and the men come back and figure out that Lottie has been running the hospital for 11 days and everything's been going just fine. So then she decides, well, I'm going back to my home. And they say, like, no, you can't go back to your home. There's too much fighting. And her name had such, at this point, that's 1911. By this point, her name carried such weight in China that she has an official escort, and both sides stop fighting and allow her to cross through battle lines to get back to her home, which is a pretty amazing thing. That she's, even when, and that's often true of her life, even when other people chose to leave, Lottie Moon stays. She does hard things for the sake of the gospel. One of the biggest things that I want to talk about, one of those most lasting impacts that Lottie Moon has is the way she writes, and the way that she writes both to the Foreign Mission Board in particular, and to the presidents and the leaders there, but to Southern Baptists in general, and the way that she would write home. Her lasting legacy is not just what she did in China, but her lasting legacy is the impact that she had on the SBC, and particularly in the way we send and raise support for missionaries, and ultimately through the Lottie Moon Christmas offering. So she began suggesting that a Christmas offering would be taken up to raise money for foreign missions. And so the WMU, this is through letters that she writes back home, the WMU, the Women's Missionary Union, creates the foreign missions offering in 1888 at her suggestion. Now, at that time, it was called the Foreign Missions Offering. So later in her life, and later, I think after her death in 1918, they decide, it was at Lottie Moon's behest that we made this. This is sort of her legacy. Why don't we change this then to the Lottie Moon Christmas Offering? So it changes in 1918 to Lottie Moon Christmas Offering, but it was originally the Foreign Missions Offering. But it was Lottie who said, we need to take up at least a yearly offering to help to fund foreign missions. It was her idea. She writes, I wonder how many of us really believe that it is more blessed to give than receive. A woman who accepts that statement of our Lord Jesus Christ as a fact and not as an impractical idealism will make giving a principle of her life. She will lay aside sacredly not less than 1/10 of her income or her earnings as the Lord's money, which she would no more dare touch for personal use than she would steal. How many there are among our women, alas, who imagine that because, quote, Jesus paid it all, they need pay nothing, forgetting that the prime object of their salvation was that they should follow the footsteps of Jesus. Right? She said that we ought to be so convicted that the money we set aside for tithe, that to use that money for personal gain would be like stealing from the Lord. And we wouldn't steal from God, so we wouldn't take the money that should be sent for offerings. So she writes countless letters about this, countless letters urging Southern Baptists to give, because she's on the field. She feels the strain of lack of support. She feels the strain when offerings are low and the Foreign Mission Board doesn't have the money they need. So she's writing, understanding what is still true today. To send missionaries costs money. I wish it didn't. I wish that it was free. I wish that it were cheap, but it's not. Sending people on the other side to the other side of the world, training them to speak languages, helping them to make connections, allowing them to have a place to live, providing health care, all those things, it costs money, it's expensive. And so Lottie Moon understood this, and so she's writing back asking for support. Not only that she writes often asking not just for money, but for more workers. So I'm going to read you, I put a couple in your handout. I'm going to read you a few more letters from her. As always, I want to give you, when we talk about these missionaries, I want you to hear them in their voice. I want you to hear their words. So I'm going to read a few longer letters from Lottie Moon that she writes back. I'll read this first one that's in your handout. November 1st, 1873. What we need in China is more workers. The harvest is very great. The laborers oh so few. Why does the Southern Baptist Church lag behind in this great work? I think your idea is correct, that a young man should ask himself not if it is his duty to go to the heathen, but if he dare stay home. The command is so plain, go. She writes in another time, 1875, this is a letter back home. The harvest is plenteous, the laborers are few. What we find missionaries can do in the way of preaching the gospel, even in the immediate neighborhood of this city, is but as the thousandth part of a drop in the bucket compared with what should be done. 4 or 5 laborers cannot possibly cultivate a radius of 20 miles. So cannot we, a mission of 5 people, do more than make a beginning of what should be done? But is there no way to arouse the churches on this subject? We implore you to send us help. Let not these heathens sink down into eternal death without one opportunity to hear the blessed gospel, which is to you the source of all joy and comfort. The work that is constantly pressed upon us is greater than time or strength permits us to do." She writes, November 11th, 1878, "But how inadequate our force. Here is a province of 30 million souls, and Southern Baptists can only send one man and 3 women to tell them the story of redeeming love. Oh, that my words could be as a trumpet call, stirring the hearts of my brethren and sisters to pray, to labor, to give themselves to this people. We are now a very, very few feeble workers, scattering the grain broadcast according as time and strength permit. God will give the harvest, doubt it not, but the laborers are so few. Where we have 4, we should have not less than 100. Are these wild words? They would not seem so were the church of God awake to her high privilege and her weighty responsibilities." So she writes back. She pulls no punches. April 27th, 1874. She writes, "Oh, that we had active and zealous men who would go far and wide, scattering books and tracts and preaching the word to the vast multitudes of this land." That she's aware of the lack of men in the country. November 4th, 1875, she writes, "I write today, moved by feelings which come over me constantly when I go out on country trips. The harvest is plenteous, and the laborers are few." Right, she, again, is calling people. It's one of these interior trips that she realizes just the dearth of folks who are coming to the gospel, or the dearth of folks who are coming to preach the gospel. April 14th, 1876, she writes, "There was a large crowd pretty soon in attendance, so many that the hall would not hold them, and they adjourned to the yard. I hope you won't think me desperately unfeminine, but I spoke to them all, men, women, and children, pleading them to turn from their idolatry to the true and living God. I should not have dared to remain silent with so many souls before me sunk in heathen darkness." It's one of those times when she preaches because there's nobody else to do it. October 10th, 1878, she writes, "It's odd that with 500 Baptist preachers in the state of Virginia, we must rely on a Presbyterian minister to fill a Baptist pulpit." There's a Presbyterian pastor who's with her in China. "I wonder how these things look in heaven. They certainly look very queer in China. But then we Baptists are a great people, as we never tire of saying that our associations and conventions and possibly our way of doing things is the best." I love Lottie Moon. I love the way she writes. She writes, this is an open letter in the Religious Herald, was a magazine put out by the Baptist. It's not dated. She writes, "I am trying honestly to do the work that could fill the hands of 3 or 4 women, and in addition must do work that ought to be done by young men. Our dilemma, to do men's work or to sit silent at religious services conducted by men just emerging from heathenism." January 8th, 1889, she writes, "There is so much work to be done, too, that ought to be done by men. A young woman could not do the work and retain the respect of Chinese men." It's another interesting point in the culture that she's gonna have the ear of women and children, but she's not gonna have the ear often of Chinese men, and she understands that just because of cultural conditions. "While I do not a little for the men and the boys, I do not feel bound to stay on their account. Still, I must add that the work is suffering and will continue to suffer in that department for want of a man living on the spot." September 1877, this is in the Foreign Mission Journal that's put out by the Baptist. "In the vast continent of Africa, we have 1 white missionary and 1 colored. In Japan, we have not 1. In China, we have at present 8 missionaries. Putting the population of China at 400 million, that's true of the time, this gives 1 missionary for 50 million people. Yet we call ourselves Missionary Baptists. Our Lord says, 'Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature.' Are we obeying this command?" This is Lottie Moon's life as she writes back. She's not just asking for support, but she's pulling no punches and saying, we're failing as Baptists to do what we ought to. We have this opportunity here to share the gospel, and we can't get people to go.
It's also pretty cool that they're actually publishing the letter.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's an amazing. It shows you what sort of respect that Lottie Moon had gained in the Southern Baptist Convention, and it shows you the way the sovereignty of God works. That this was literally at the time before she leaves China, one of the most educated women in the South. That Lottie Moon has the ability to write that maybe some other folks wouldn't have because of her education, because of her intellect. She can write. She can write really, really well. And so they ask her to write a lot. And especially at this time, we are connected to people through Facebook and social media and Twitter and those sort of things. People were fascinated by missionaries. And so they were happy to like read stuff and print stuff from missionaries. And so Lottie Moon takes that opportunity and lays it on people, which I really love. I'll read one more to you. This is May 1889. This is also in the Foreign Mission Journal. One cannot help asking sadly, why is love of gold more potent than the love of souls? The number of men mining and prospecting for gold in Shantung, right, so there are Westerners coming to mine gold in China, is more than double the number of men representing Southern Baptists. What a lesson for Southern Baptists to ponder. This is one of the biggest legacies that she has, and that she is calling on Southern Baptists not just to give to the cause, but to send people, to send especially men. That she realized that they needed not just women, they needed men. So she's writing this call home. One of the other things that she's really influential in is really supporting the idea of missionary furloughs. So at this point, we talked about this with Taylor a little bit and some of the other guys. For a long time, it was partly because of logistics and cost and the danger of travel. It was expected that once you went, you stayed. And sickness, health, whatever happened, you took no trips home. You took no vacations. You took no furlough. You stayed. Often that led to early death. Often that led to missionaries dying. What would seem to be before what would be sort of a more natural death if they were healthy. They died early. Lottie Moon is the one that begins to press for missionary furlough, both for mental reasons, mental health reasons, spiritual reasons, but for health reasons, for physical health reasons, that it's better for people to have a trip home. So she pushes that missionaries should return home for furlough at least once every 10 years. And then that helps to extend their life and their effectiveness. I believe it's different depending on what region you're in now. I believe IMB often gives furloughs every 4 to 5 years, and sometimes sooner, depending on where you are and what sort of stress you're under. We have friends who serve in sub-Saharan Africa, and so they were there, I believe, for 3.5 years, and then were home for 10 months. Had almost a full year home. Their kids were able to go through a whole year of school here in the States. They got to spend holidays with families, and then they went back, and they'll be back there at least. They went back a year ago, so they'll be back for at least another 2.5 years. But it's much, much easier to do now, right? It's just a plane ride for most of these people to get them to a city and fly them home. That furloughs are good, just to give you a breather. Missionaries, especially ones that in really hard places, live under a great deal of just constant stress and constant pressure. And so to have them even just a moment to sort of be able to step out of that and to be home and to be with family and to be in a familiar place and to breathe a little bit extends both the life and the effectiveness of their ministry. So Lottie Moon's one of the first people to really begin to press for that. A lot of her letters that we have are to a guy named Dr. H.A. Tupper, who was at the time the head of the missions board. And so she's writing to him about these sort of things. Later in her life, she struggles both with physical and mental illness, ultimately with depression, which is not a surprise. It's what we've seen out of every missionary that we've talked about. They've struggled with depression to some degree. Lottie's is pretty mild compared to some of the other folks, but she does struggle. Finally, in December, she's actually on her way home. There were some other missionaries who were in the area. I don't think I put this in there, but they write a letter essentially back to Dr. Tupper and say, we need to bring Lottie home. We're with her, and she's not in her right mind. She's not doing well. So there are accounts of her life. This is one of the interesting things about sort of trying to research the life of these missionaries long after the fact. So reports are that when Lottie died, she had shrunk down to like 50 pounds, that she was incredibly gaunt, that she was giving, at the time there was a famine in China, so she was giving her food to the Chinese so that they could eat. She had reports that she had given away all of her money, that she was in really, really poor condition. And so they're sending her home in order so she can come back to the States and recover. Within the last, I think, a couple, 20 years or so, there have been some scholars who have done some research on Lottie Moon's life and said, Now, this is obviously arguments among scholars, that they think that at the end of her life she actually wasn't starving. She actually still had money in the bank, but so that she had dementia and that she had lost her mind. And so when she writes letters talking about how her health, how bad her health is, about how she's given away her food, about how she has no money, that she believes all those things to be true, but that she had lost touch with reality, which would connect within what we do read from missionaries who find her and say, Lottie is not in her right mind. We need to bring her home, that she's not connected to reality. We need to get her back to the States. So whether she gives away all her food and she is starving at the end of her life, or whether she has dementia and thinks she has, either way, I don't think it diminishes the work and the life and the faithfulness of Lottie Moon. But it is an interesting sort of debate now amongst scholars. Obviously, we weren't there. We can't know exactly what it looked like for her at the end of her life. But there is some debate about what impact her mental health at the end of her life had upon her physical health, and then even how we sort of view her. I think about that now. I sort of hate that I know that, because now every time I read about Lottie Moon, people talk about how she was starving at the end of her life. I think, well, yeah, probably. I think, maybe. I don't know for sure. We can't tell. Either way, this is the lady who gives her whole life for the sake of the Chinese. That she is constantly caring well and caring deeply for them as she's trying to share the gospel. And we do know that throughout her life, she does give away her food a lot. So if she does that at the end of her life, that wouldn't be outside of what would be characteristic and normal for her to do. It's something that she would do. To what degree she was doing that at the end of her life, we don't know. She dies on December 24th on Christmas Eve. And so just 1 week from today, in 1912, and as we said, in the harbor on a ship outside of Kobe, Japan, she was bound for the United States. So we think she was frail, weak, and around 50 pounds because she gave much of her food to the starving Chinese. We don't know that for sure. We think that. I still think that's probably true, but it's interesting to think about. She on her deathbed says to a friend, Jesus is here right now. You can pray now that he will fill my heart and stay with me. For when Jesus comes in, he drives out all evil. Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Little ones to him belong, they are weak, but he is strong. Do you know this song, Mrs. Miller? One of the most interesting things for me as I've studied these folks to teach this class is to hear the things they say when they know they're about to die. And just sort of the sweetness that it's this song, Jesus Loves Me, that she quotes on her deathbed as she knows that she's about to die there on that ship. I want to talk about some ways that she intersects with SBC life and some other areas outside of the Lottie Moon Christmas offering, and then some impact. But before I do that, any questions about her? Again, I'm not a Lottie Moon expert, so I may not be able to answer, but I'll try.
Did they ship her home to be buried?
She was cremated, I believe, but she did come back to Virginia. They did bring her back home, all the way back. Any other questions about her life up to this point? All right, I want to talk about two just interesting things, interesting ways that her life interacts with and impacts the SBC. Her life gives us an opportunity to talk about some interesting issues in the SBC. We'll talk about I think the more important one in a second. But she has this relationship with a guy named Crawford Toy. Anybody heard Crawford Toy's name before? So Crawford Toy actually was one of her teachers when she was at the Female Institute in Virginia, the female version of the University of Virginia. Later in life, they develop a romantic relationship. While she's in China, she still keeps in contact with him. When she comes back home in 1876 to bring Edmonia home, she meets and sees Crawford again and sort of rekindles this relationship with him. Crawford was, by all accounts, a brilliant guy. He was maybe not a genius, but pretty close. He was a really brilliant guy. He goes to Germany for a little while, and he studies in Germany. And while he's there, he's a Bible scholar. He's highly affected by what was at the time called historical critical understanding of the Bible. So we're not sure, or at least at the time when he comes back, they're not sure how much that's affected him. It'll come out shortly how that has affected him. In 1870, he is hired as a professor at Southern Seminary. So Southern Seminary begins in 1859. I don't know when it moves to Louisville. It begins in Greenville, South Carolina, and shuts down for a time because of the Civil War, and then eventually moves to Louisville, Kentucky. But in 1870, which I believe it's already in Louisville by that point, in 1870, he becomes a professor at the Southern Baptist Seminary. When you become a professor at Southern, from the very beginning, you have to sign something called the Abstract of Principles. Herschel has signed the Abstract of Principles. It's a really cool document. So Herschel, on the original document, you can flip the pages back, and you could find Herschel York's name, and then you could find Crawford Toy's name. It's the same document. Everybody that teaches there has to sign the Abstract of Principles, saying that you agree to teach within the Abstract of Principles. It's essentially a Baptist confession of faith. So Toy signs this to teach at Southern, and then before long it becomes clear that his influence from German scholars has been much deeper than they thought. Essentially, he comes to believe the higher critical method, which says there's no way that miracles really happen. That what's important from the Bible is the lessons that you learn from it, not whether those things are actually true. So, what's important is what you learn from Jonah's life, not whether Jonah ever actually lived. So what's important is what Jesus is trying to teach you through these accounts of the miracles, not whether Jesus actually fed 5,000 people, right? So he would say he didn't think that happened. So he begins to deny the miraculous in the Bible. He buys in wholeheartedly to Darwin's theory of evolution. So he would say in his mind, I still believe the Bible is inspired, but what he means by inspiration is very different than what the rest of this other faculty means by inspired. He means inspired in the way that you might, if you saw Star Wars this week, you might come away saying, man, that movie is inspired. I've never seen any of the Star Wars, so I don't know if they're inspired or not. But you might read a poem or hear a song and say, man, that's inspired, that's special. He would say, man, that thing is special, but he wouldn't then say that the Bible has no errors, that it is in that sense the Word of God. So eventually he's fired from Southern Seminary. While all this is going on, he has this relationship with Lottie Moon, who at this point has returned to China. They're, depending on who, this is another great area, depending on who you ask, they either were going to be engaged or they were engaged. We don't know for sure. In some places it seems like they're already engaged. In some places it seems like they're talking about being engaged, but they're not yet. We don't know. Either way, they were definitely going to get married. At one point, Lottie is frustrated with Foreign Mission Board, with Southern Baptist, because of their lack of support, because of the lack of people they're sending. And she writes to Dr. H.A. Tubber and says, I'm leaving China. I'm going to go. After he's fired from Southern, he goes and he teaches at Harvard, and he teaches the rest of his life at Harvard. And she says, I'm going to leave, and I'm going to go to Harvard. I'm going to marry Crawford Toy, and I'm going to leave the field. Sometime after that, she breaks off the relationship with Crawford Toy, and she tells in letters to her sister, the reason is because of his theology, that she is finally able to sort of see where he is on the Bible and to see where he is and what he believes about God. And so she breaks off that relationship. He teaches for the rest of his life at Harvard, and he dies a Unitarian. He doesn't even claim to be a Christian by the end of his life. He's a practicing Unitarian. So it's just an interesting way that Lottie intersects with sort of a big name in SBC history, one of the first professors fired from Southern Seminary for teaching outside the Abstract of Principles. So it's an interesting way her life intersects with him. The other big way that I want to talk about that Lottie gives us an opportunity to talk about her life and the SBC is both the formation and some of the issues of the SBC from the beginning. So anybody remember what year did we say the SBC started? 1845. Anybody know why the SBC starts? Slavery. So at the time, Baptists were a part of a National Baptist Convention, an American Baptist Convention. Attitudes in the North were changing, and attitudes in the South were not. And so in 1845, the National Convention decides that they're not going to send any missionary. They won't commission any missionary who owns slaves. So Baptists in the South nominate a guy named James Reeves, and they nominated him as a test that he owned slaves, and so they nominate him as a foreign missionary, and the mission board denies him. They won't take him. So this is the end of the line for Baptists in the South. They break away and form the Southern Baptist Convention, and in their writings, the first president, his name was William Johnson. Right, in their writings, as they formed the SBC in 1845, right, they say the reason they are doing this is because they want to be able to still own slaves and send missionaries. So a really tragic thing to think about when we think about our Southern Baptist Convention, that we started because people in the South wanted to own slaves and send missionaries, and they couldn't do it where they were, so they started a convention that would allow them to do that. The first president of the Southern Baptist Convention, William Johnson, owned slaves. This church started in 1818. The first pastor of this church, John Taylor, owned slaves. The first president of Southern Seminary starts in 1859. James P. Boyce is the founder, owned slaves. Broadus, one of the founding professors, owned slaves. Basil Manley Sr., who helped to write the Abstract of Principles, right? Helped to write what is one of the most beautiful Baptist confessions of faith in the English language, right? Still used today at Southern Seminary. Basil Manley Sr. helps to write that one. He helps to write the Abstract of Principles. He owned slaves, and we actually have letters where Basil Manley Sr. Talks about that the money that his slaves to him are the same thing as money that he has in his pocket from selling corn. That they're like, to him they are equivalent. His son Basil Manley Sr. or Basil Manley Jr. rather is one of the beginning professors at Southern Seminary. Also owned slaves. It's a hard thing for us to think about. Men who we respect and honor, who got so many other things right, and yet missed it on this big of an issue. They just missed it. Some of the things that you read from Broadus and his view of African Americans are disgusting, and the way that they viewed them as subhuman. We see this influence in Lottie Moon's life. Lottie Moon's from the South. Her family owned slaves. She was a nurse for the Confederate Army. She was infected with the same thinking as most of the SBC at the time, which was that whites are a superior race and every other race is inferior. And so they saw that owning slaves was a kindness to them because they are an inferior race. Broadus writes at one point that they are an inferior race that is well suited to slavery. And so they see that what they're doing is a kindness to them, that this superior race would bestow the gospel upon this inferior race. When Lottie gets to China, she takes this with her. Not just with African Americans, but with Chinese. So at the beginning, she does not adopt Chinese dress. And if you read some of her early letters home, you'll be surprised by the way she speaks about the Chinese. She says the same thing. She writes to a friend. There's this long letter that she's sort of feels like she's rambling on, and she says to him towards the end, basically, I hope that I've not bored you. Being around these heathens has made me stupid. In another letter she writes to her sister, that one of the reasons she's able to at least have people talk to her when she goes into villages is because the inferior race is intrigued by the superior race. That she sees herself as a white woman as a separate entity, right? Not just that she's smarter, or she knows more about the gospel, but that she's different, that she is a superior race to the Chinese. Now, by God's grace, throughout her time in China, through her time that she spends with these people, the more she learns the scriptures, the more God works on her heart. That's not what we see in her writings at the end of her life. It's why she adopts Chinese dress. It's why she lives the way that she does in China. It's not right. So I don't think Lottie Moon stays there, right? But it is sort of an ugly part about her life. That's at least where she begins, and that was the culture of the SBC at the time. And so it's still a stain that we carry. That this is why the SBC was created, was because of this attachment to slavery. And so sometimes people say, well, that happened a long time ago. Why does that still matter? Why do we still talk about that? It's because these things still affect us. 200 years is not that long when it comes to these sort of things. Anybody want to know the first African American appointed by the Foreign Mission Board? What year? You can take a guess. 1968 rather. 1968. So that's not that long ago. 1968. Want to know the first African American president of the SBC? 2012. Now, either there have been no qualified African Americans for 175 years, Or maybe we still might have a little bit of a race issue in the SBC. 2012. Right? So there are still issues in the SBC. There are, sometimes I'm asked by folks why we don't have more African Americans in the SBC. Should I ask you, put yourself in their position and say, was this the convention that you would necessarily join? Maybe not. Maybe not. I think the best way to deal with these things is not to act like they don't happen. Oh, sorry. Here, by the way, there's a picture of Crawford Toy if you want to see him. Handsome devil. The best thing to do is not to pretend that these things didn't happen or to sweep them under the rug, but to call them what they are, to say, we're thankful for the way that God used Broadus, that God used the early founders of the Southern Seminary, these early founders of the Southern Baptist Convention. We're thankful that they got so many things right. But to say they missed it here. They had this huge gaping hole in their theology in which they had no problem with slavery and even actively supported it. We have to acknowledge that. We have to say that we as a convention, the first time the Southern Baptist Convention issues a resolution officially saying we repent from our beginnings. We repent from our love of slavery. Anybody want to guess that year? 1995. We passed a lot of resolutions on race between 1845 and 1995. And the first time that we acknowledge as a convention that we are repentant and sorry and grieved over the way we started is 1995. The way we move forward is not by pretending it didn't happen, by being thankful for what we can and trying to learn from them. Right? It terrifies me that these men who knew the Bible. I've read Broadus' biography. I've read his systematic theology. He's got a book it's called On the Preparation and Delivery of Sermons. It is one of the best books on preaching that I have ever read. If you read it right now, it would seem like he wrote it today. It is a tremendous book. It terrifies me that these men who know the Bible so well, who have a love for the Lord, who know theology, had this big of a hole in their life, because it makes me think, what things will our great-grandchildren look back and say, they got so many things right, but they missed it here? What blind spots do we have? Right? What areas are we not allowing the Scriptures to convict us and to speak into our lives and to speak into the way we operate? It's a huge worry for me. And I think one of the things we learn from this is to say it can be possible to love the Lord and to still miss it in a big way. Where are we missing it? Where are we still dropping the ball? Maybe it's issues that are similar to this. Maybe it's other issues. But I don't want my grandkids to have to look back and to say, man, I'm thankful for 75% of my grandfather's ministry, but I'm sort of ashamed about this 25% because he missed this thing. He just totally ignored the Scriptures here and was way off base in the way that we look back at the Southern Baptist Convention. So Lottie provides us an opportunity to talk a little bit about that because we see that influence in her life, even early on as a missionary in China. We see her writing back. By God's grace, she moves away from that, as lots of Southern Baptists do. But it's still something we're wrestling with. I just read yesterday was an old Sunday school board pamphlet on how to go into your neighborhood and to recruit people for your Sunday school, how to go and get people to come. And so they give them this really specific list of what you're supposed to do. And the list is like, make sure you're signing up everybody in the household, make sure you're taking records well, make sure you're getting the correct ages so we know which class to put them in, make sure you're doing everything you can. You know what the very first thing on the list was? Item number 1. Only go to every white home. It was 1928. That was not just a church that put that out. That was the Southern Baptist Sunday School Board. This is how you reach people in your neighborhood for the gospel. Number 1, only go to white homes. And then make sure you sign them up really well. It's a tragic thing, but it's still, right? This is not gone from us completely. Is the SBC in a much better spot now than they were in 1845 or in 1928? Absolutely, I think we are. But this is something that we're still struggling with. We're still dealing with. If my grandmother would not have been welcome in a church, I doubt that I would be a member of that convention. Something we still live with, something that still affects us. So it's an interesting thing for us to think about as we think about the SBC and how Lottie Moon connects with them. Anything, we've got just like 20 seconds. We can take some time. As you've thought about Lottie Moon, or maybe any of our other missionaries, anything that has impacted you, anything that you think we can learn, I put the impact of Lottie Moon in some other ways. We've talked about most of those. You could read those. I'm not going to cover those right now. I will say, since the Lottie Moon Christmas offering happened, before it was named Lottie Moon, in total, $4.4 billion collected for missions. So even in the midst of bad things happening, Southern Baptists are still doing really good things. Buck Run since 1980, nearly $5 million to Great Commission causes, which is a big, big deal. So anything about Lottie Moon or about any of these missionaries that you has impacted you that you want to share with us?
Chris, I just want to thank you for teaching us about these 6 individuals, warts and all.
It's been my joy and pleasure.
So one of the things that you brought out is the IMB, and we're setting 3,600 out. There's a transition among mission boards to have more indigenous folks that we fund together.
Mm-hmm.
How is the IMB doing that, or are they late to the party again, or are you seeing them participate in this?
Yeah, it's one of the things I've been encouraged by David Platt, and since he's been president. He's made some really good shifts. One of those shifts is working with more indigenous pastors, finding ways to train more indigenous pastors, so that the folks who are there, the missionaries who are there, are helping to plant indigenous churches that are led by indigenous pastors. Who understand the culture. And that's not always, you're right, that's not always been the case. It's been, we'll plant churches and we'll stick a missionary as the pastor. We have finally arrived at the place where we're realizing that's not the best way to reach people. Is that we want to plant churches. We want to train them and train them well so that they can run healthy churches and they can lead healthy churches, but healthy churches led by indigenous people. And the other thing that I've been pleased with is the way he's broadened the path for people to get overseas. So if you want to be a full-time IMB missionary, there's still a seminary requirement. You don't have to have a full MDiv, but there still is I'm not sure what the hours are. I think it's like 30, what is it? It's 30-something, I think, hours you have to be a full-time missionary. So that's still the case. But he is opening more avenues for folks like Kenny and Cheryl, somebody who says, I had another career, I retired, I've got life left within me, I've still got health, I've got some skills. He's finding ways to put those people on the field. He's encouraging people who have, people who are retiring and sitting on a huge nest egg. So more and more people are retiring early, and they're retiring early with more money than they ever have before. And so if you retire at 48, 50, and you have a lot of money, and you can support yourself, well, how about we give you some training, and we'll find a place where you can go serve with a missionary. And so instead of where it used to be, if we wanted to have 4 people in a city, that was going to be 4 people we had to fully fund. Now it might be we have 3 people there that we fully fund, and we might have 12 people there who are partially funded, who are training, who are there on their own time, who are there because they asked their company to transfer them there, finding other ways to get more people there that aren't necessarily fully funded by the IMB. So where you might have 3 before, you might have now 3 full-time and 12, 15 to have a bigger team there, which is good for those full-time missionaries and cause those people to live their life on mission who are, if people are going to work for Shell Oil, is there a big difference in working from Shell Oil in Houston or in Abu Dhabi, right? If you can go to Abu Dhabi, that's what the IMB is saying. If you can go, why don't you go, right? Not everybody's going to be able to get in. Not everybody's going to be able to live there and support themselves. If you can do it, you do it and finding ways. I've been really excited about that. I think that's something we need we need more people on the field. And not everybody's going to be able to go as a full-time missionary. And so being able to find creative ways to get more people out there, I think is a really, really good thing.